October 8th, 2024. The excavator's steel bucket cracked through the concrete floor of the abandoned Andalusia textile mill with the sound of breaking bones. Foreman Marcus Riley had demolished dozens of old buildings across southern Alabama, but when the concrete shattered that Tuesday morning, what lay beneath made him raise his fist to signal the operator, "Stop everything." 3 feet down, wrapped in deteriorating canvas tarp, were human remains. Riley's voice cracked over the radio. "Shut it down! Shut everything down right now! We need police out here!" The leather purse lay nearby, tucked into a corner of the concrete tomb. 45 years, sealed in darkness, had preserved it in ways that defied logic. When investigators carefully opened it hours later, they found a driver's license with a photograph of a young woman smiling at the camera. Auburn hair, warm eyes, a face frozen in time from an era when disco ruled the radio and gas lines stretched around city blocks. The name on the license, Violet Grace Thompson. The date, 1979. For 45 years, a killer walked the streets of Andalusia, Alabama. He attended church services on Sundays. He fixed neighbors' lawnmowers in his spare time. He bought groceries at the same store every Thursday afternoon. He was the kind of person you'd pass on the sidewalk without a second glance, invisible in the way that only the perfectly ordinary can be. While a family spent 4.5 decades searching for their daughter, while a mother lit a candle in the window every single morning until the day she died, while a father turned his garage into a command center covered in maps and pins and desperate theories, the man who knew exactly where Violet Thompson was buried lived just 20 miles away. Could someone in your community be hiding a dark secret? Think about the people you see every day. The neighbor who waves from his driveway, the regular customer at your coffee shop who always orders the same thing, the quiet person at church who sits in the back pew and leaves immediately after services. How well do you really know them? What secrets might they be carrying behind their perfectly maintained facades? In small-town Alabama, where everybody knows everybody, or thinks they do, one man understood that the best hiding place is in plain sight. He understood that if you keep your lawn trimmed, if you mind your own business, if you never draw attention to yourself, people will look right past you. For 45 years, that's exactly what happened. One demolished building would finally expose the truth. The textile mill had closed its doors in 1982, another casualty of the South's industrial decline. For more than 4 decades, it stood empty on the eastern edge of Andalusia. Windows broken, walls covered in kudzu vines, floor slowly crumbling. Teenagers dared each other to explore it at night. Urban explorers photographed its decay. Real estate developers occasionally discussed tearing it down, but never followed through. The building kept its secret, year after year, while the world moved on around it. Until October 8th, 2024, when an excavator's bucket broke through concrete that should never have been poured in a textile mill basement. Concrete that had been added sometime after the mill closed. Concrete that someone had used to seal away evidence of a murder that had haunted Covington County for nearly half a century. But here's the question that would shock the community to its core. How did he hide for so long? How does a man commit murder, bury his victim beneath concrete, and then live freely for 45 years? How does he attend the same churches, shop at the same stores, exist in the same small-town ecosystem as the family desperately searching for their missing daughter? How does he look people in the eye, year after year, carrying the weight of what he's done, and never slip up? never confess, never show a crack in the mask? The answers would prove more disturbing than anyone expected. Before we reveal how this case was finally solved, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is at your location. Your engagement helps bring attention to cold cases that deserve justice. Andalusia, Alabama, in 1979 was the kind of place where Friday night football games drew half the town, where the courthouse square served as the unofficial center of social life, and where your reputation was built on generations of family history. With just over 9,000 residents scattered across Covington County's rolling hills and farmland, it was a community where doors stayed unlocked, where neighbors brought casseroles when someone fell ill, and where everyone knew not just your name, but your parents' names, and probably your grandparents' too. The late 1970s had brought changes to this corner of southeastern Alabama. Gas lines stretched around city blocks during the energy crisis. Inflation worried families who had always managed to make ends meet. The textile mill that employed hundreds of residents hummed along, but people whispered concerns about manufacturing jobs disappearing to other countries. Still, Andalusia retained its essential character, a place where church attendance remained steady, where the downtown drugstore's soda fountain stayed busy on Saturday afternoons, and where high school sweethearts still got married and settled down within 5 miles of where they grew up. Into this world, Violet Grace Thompson had been born on March 15, 1959, the first child of Walter and Dorothy Thompson. Walter worked as a supervisor at the Andalusia lumber mill, a position that provided steady if modest income for his growing family. He was the kind of man who believed in hard work, honest dealing, and showing up early. Dorothy, petite with boundless energy and a smile that put everyone at ease, devoted herself to raising Violet and eventually her younger siblings. Carolyn, born in 1962, and Frank, born in 1965. The Thompson home on Hillcrest Avenue was a white frame house with a front porch where Dorothy kept flower boxes filled with petunias each spring. The house was modest but immaculate, reflecting the pride the family took in what they had. Inside, you'd find Dorothy's piano in the living room, where she played hymns on Sunday afternoons. Walter's workshop in the garage, where he repaired everything from toasters to lawnmowers, and 3 bedrooms that echoed with the sounds of childhood. Laughter, arguments over whose turn it was to do dishes, Caroline practicing her clarinet. The Thompsons were faithful members of First Baptist Church of Andalusia, where Walter served as a deacon and Dorothy taught Sunday school. They weren't wealthy or particularly prominent, but they were respected. In a town where character mattered more than money, Walter and Dorothy Thompson had built a reputation as good people raising good children. Violet had grown into a striking young woman by her 20th year. She stood 5'6" with auburn hair that fell in waves past her shoulders. Hair she usually wore pulled back during work shifts, but let loose on weekends. Her hazel eyes shifted between green and gold, depending on the light, a trait that made her easy to recognize even across a crowded room. She had inherited her mother's delicate features and her father's steady disposition, creating a combination that friends described as both beautiful and approachable. After graduating from Andalusia High School in 1977, Violet had harbored dreams of attending Auburn University to study elementary education. She had always loved children, spending her teenage years babysitting for neighborhood families and helping with the church nursery every Sunday morning. Her face would light up when she talked about becoming a teacher, about having her own classroom someday, about making a difference in young lives the way her favorite teachers had impacted hers. But Auburn's tuition was beyond what the Thompson family could afford. Walter had sat Violet down shortly after graduation and explained the reality with tears in his eyes. They simply didn't have the money. Violet had hugged her father and told him not to worry. She would save up and go to college when she could afford it. She wasn't giving up on her dream. She was just postponing it. That determination led her to the Red Door Cafe, a downtown establishment that served as an unofficial community hub. The cafe occupied a corner building on Main Street, its red door visible from the courthouse square. Inside, red vinyl booths lined the walls. A long counter separated the dining area from the kitchen, and the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon filled the air from dawn until closing. Farmers discussed crop prices over breakfast. Businessmen held informal meetings during lunch, and teenagers crowded into booths after football games on Friday nights. Violet had been working at the Red Door for nearly 2 years by the fall of 1979. She worked the early shift, arriving at 6 a.m. to help set up, serving through the breakfast and lunch rushes, clocking out at 2 p.m. The work was demanding, requiring her to be on her feet for 8 hours straight, balancing heavy plates, remembering orders, handling demanding customers with grace. But Violet was good at it. Regular customers requested her section. She remembered how Mr. Patterson took his coffee, black, no sugar, and that Mrs. Henderson always split a grilled cheese with her granddaughter on Tuesdays. Marlene Patterson, who owned the cafe, often told people that Violet Thompson was the best waitress she'd ever hired. "That girl remembers every regular's order without writing it down," Marlene would say, "and she's got a way of making people feel welcome, like they're sitting down at their own kitchen table." By November 1979, Violet had saved nearly $2,000 toward her college fund, a substantial amount earned dollar by dollar in tips and hourly wages. She kept the money in a savings account at First National Bank and tracked every deposit in a small notebook she carried in her purse. Auburn's January 1980 enrollment was just weeks away, and Violet had already requested the application, materials. Her personal life had also begun to blossom. Daniel Holloway, a 23-year-old mechanic at Barnett's Auto Repair, had been courting her since spring. Daniel was sandy-haired with an easy smile and a gentle nature that complemented Violet's warmth. He took her to movies at the Cinema Theater, bought her ice cream at the Tasty Freeze, and treated her with the kind of respect that made Walter Thompson approve of the relationship. Violet confided to her sister Caroline that she thought Daniel might propose by Christmas. She was 20 years old with her entire life stretching before her like an open road. She had dreams, plans, love, family, and a community that adored her. She was saving for college. She was falling in love. She was helping her mother plan the church Christmas pageant and teaching her brother Frank to drive. She had no idea that someone was watching her. Someone who had been watching her for months. Someone who had already decided how her story would end. Saturday, November 10th, 1979, began like any other Saturday in Violet Thompson's life. Her alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 a.m., pulling her from sleep while darkness still blanketed Andalusia. She dressed in her Red Door Cafe uniform, a red and white striped dress with white collar and cuffs, pulled her auburn hair into a ponytail, and kissed her still sleeping mother goodbye before climbing into her powder blue 1972 Dodge Dart. The car had been a high school graduation gift from her parents, bought used but reliable. Violet loved that car, had named it Blue Bell, and kept the interior spotless. She arrived at the Red Door Cafe at 5:52 a.m. Marlene Patterson was already inside, starting the coffee and prepping for the breakfast rush. The two women worked together in comfortable rhythm, Violet setting tables while Marlene got the grill heated and the bacon started. By 6 a.m., when the cafe officially opened, they were ready for the first customers. Saturday mornings at the Red Door were consistently busy. Farmers came in after their early chores. Families stopped by before running weekend errands. The cafe filled with the sounds of conversation, clinking silverware, and the bell above the door announcing each new arrival. Violet worked her section with practiced efficiency, balancing plates along her arms, refilling coffee cups without being asked, laughing at Mr. Thompson's terrible jokes. No relation to her family, but he made the same quip every Saturday anyway. At 9:47 a.m., during a brief lull in the breakfast rush, Violet walked the 3 blocks to First National Bank. She carried her tips from the week in an envelope, $73 in cash that she intended to deposit into her college savings account. The bank's security camera captured her entering at 9:51 a.m., wearing her waitress uniform and carrying her purse over her shoulder. She waited in line behind 2 other customers, chatted briefly with teller Margaret Simmons while making her deposit, and left at 9:58 a.m. The footage shows her smiling, relaxed, completely at ease. She was back at the Red Door by 10:05 a.m., just as the late breakfast crowd began filtering in. The next 4 hours passed in the familiar pattern of order-taking and plate serving, the controlled chaos that Violet had mastered over 2 years of waitressing. Tommy Chen, one of the cooks, later told investigators that Violet seemed completely normal that morning. Happy, even. She'd been humming while she worked, excited about a movie Daniel wanted to take her to that evening. At 2 p.m., Violet's shift ended. She clocked out, changed from her work shoes into the brown leather boots she'd worn to work, and said goodbye to Marlene. Several witnesses saw her walk to where she'd parked Blue Bell in the alley behind the cafe. She pulled out onto Main Street at approximately 2:12 p.m., heading east. At 2:34 p.m., Violet stopped at Johnson's Grocery on Highway 55. Store clerk Beverly Hughes remembered her purchasing a bottle of Coca-Cola and a pack of Double Mint gum. She was in a good mood, Beverly would later tell Sheriff Vernon Caldwell. We talked about the weather, about how nice it was for November. She said she might go for a drive before heading home since it was such a pretty afternoon. The last confirmed sighting of Violet Grace Thompson alive came at 3:15 p.m. at the Texaco station on the east side of town. Station attendant Robert Bobby Kincaid pumped $5 worth of gas into her Dodge Dart and washed her windshield. Full service was standard in 1979. Bobby remembered the transaction clearly because Violet had complimented the new Texaco sign the station had just installed. They'd talked for maybe 3 minutes while he cleaned her windows. She'd seemed perfectly fine. No signs of distress, no indication that anything was wrong. Bobby watched her drive away, heading east on County Road 41 toward the Old Mill Road intersection. After that, Violet Thompson vanished. She was expected home by 4 p.m. Dorothy Thompson had pot roast in the oven and had asked Violet to help with preparations for Sunday dinner after church the next day. When 4:30 p.m. came and went without Violet walking through the front door, Dorothy felt the first stirrings of concern. By 5 p.m., she called the Red Door Cafe, thinking perhaps Marlene had asked Violet to work late. Marlene confirmed that Violet had left on schedule at 2 p.m., more than 3 hours earlier. Walter Thompson tried calling Daniel Holloway's house. Daniel's mother answered and said Daniel was working on a car in their garage, expecting Violet to arrive any minute for their movie date. Walter's concern shifted into something deeper, a cold feeling in his gut that something was very wrong. By 6 p.m., with darkness settling over Andalusia and Violet still not home, Walter began calling her friends. Had anyone seen her? Did anyone know where she might have gone? Each call produced the same answer. No one had seen or heard from Violet since she left work. By 7 p.m., Walter knew he had to contact the authorities. At 7:15 p.m., while most of Andalusia sat in their living rooms watching the Alabama-LSU football game on television, Walter Thompson walked into the Covington County Sheriff's Office and reported his daughter missing. Deputy Curtis Perkins took the report, asking the standard questions. Could Violet have run away? No, she was saving for college and planning a future with her boyfriend. Had she been upset about anything? No, she'd been happy and excited about her life. Might she have gone somewhere without telling anyone? Absolutely not. Violet always let her parents know where she was. Deputy Perkins radioed patrol cars to begin searching for a powder blue 1972 Dodge Dart. Officers drove the streets of Andalusia throughout Saturday night, checking parking lots, scanning side streets, looking for any sign of Violet or her car. They found nothing. Sunday morning brought a new wave of panic. Violet's absence from church, where she never missed a Sunday, confirmed for the community that something terrible had happened. After services, groups of men organized search parties. They walked the roads where Violet might have driven. They searched ditches and wooded areas. They knocked on doors asking if anyone had seen anything suspicious Saturday afternoon. The searches continued throughout Sunday with no results. Monday morning, November 12, 1979, at 6:47 a.m., a textile mill worker named James Crawford spotted something in the employee parking lot that made his blood run cold. A powder blue Dodge Dart sat in the far corner of the lot, away from the other vehicles. He approached cautiously and recognized it immediately. Everyone in town knew about Violet Thompson's missing car by then. The story had spread through Andalusia like wildfire. The keys were still in the ignition. The driver's side door was unlocked. Violet's purse was gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no torn upholstery, no broken glass, no blood. The car simply sat there, abandoned, offering no answers to the question that now consumed the entire community. Where was Violet Thompson? Sheriff Vernon Caldwell arrived at the textile mill within 15 minutes of the call. He cordoned off the area and began processing what had instantly become a crime scene. The location troubled him deeply. The textile mill sat on the eastern edge of town, just off County Road 41, the same road Bobby Kincaid had seen Violet traveling when she left the Texaco station. The mill operated 6 days a week, but was closed on Sundays. Whoever left Violet's car here knew the lot would be empty on a Sunday, giving them time to disappear without being seen. The moment Violet's car was found empty, everyone knew something terrible had happened. If you're invested in this story, hit that like button. It helps ensure these victims are never forgotten. The discovery of the abandoned Dodge Dart transformed Violet's disappearance from a missing person case into something much darker. A young woman doesn't vanish into thin air. She doesn't abandon her beloved car with the keys in the ignition. She doesn't miss work and church and a date with her boyfriend without a reason. The people of Andalusia, Alabama, were about to learn that the safety they'd always taken for granted was an illusion. Their doors might have locks, but locks couldn't protect them from what was already inside their community, hiding in plain sight. Sheriff Vernon Caldwell had served Covington County for 16 years by November 1979, but he'd never handled a case like this. Missing persons in rural Alabama usually resolved themselves within hours. A teenager who'd run off to a friend's house, a drunk who'd passed out in the woods, a domestic dispute that sent someone fleeing temporarily. Young women didn't just disappear, not in Andalusia, not like this, but Caldwell's resources were painfully limited. His department consisted of himself, 2 deputies, and a dispatcher. His evidence processing capabilities extended to fingerprint powder and basic photography. The nearest forensic lab was in Montgomery, more than 90 miles away, and even that facility operated with 1970s technology that seems primitive by modern standards. There was no DNA analysis, no cell phone tracking, no surveillance camera network, no computer databases to cross-reference suspects across jurisdictions. What Caldwell did have were eyewitness accounts, physical evidence from an abandoned car that revealed nothing useful, and a community desperate for answers he couldn't provide. The investigation began where these investigations always begin, with the people closest to the victim. Daniel Holloway, Violet's boyfriend, became the immediate focus. In cases of missing or murdered women, the intimate partner is statistically the most likely suspect. Caldwell brought Daniel in for questioning on Monday afternoon, just hours after Violet's car had been discovered. Daniel sat across from Caldwell in the small interrogation room, devastated and cooperative. Yes, he and Violet had plans Saturday evening. No, they hadn't argued recently. Their relationship was good, even serious. He'd been working on a car in his parents' garage from 1 p.m. until after 7 p.m. Saturday, expecting Violet to arrive around 6:30 for their movie date. His parents confirmed the alibi. So did the neighbor who'd stopped by to borrow tools around 4:30 p.m. and had seen Daniel working. Caldwell cleared Daniel Holloway within 48 hours. The young man's grief was genuine, his alibi solid, and his cooperation complete. Daniel would spend the rest of his life wondering if there was something he could have done differently that day, some way he might have saved Violet if only he'd been paying more attention. Tips began flooding the sheriff's office. A woman reported seeing a white panel van near the Texaco station Saturday afternoon. 3 different people claimed they'd seen a man acting suspicious near the textile mill. Someone insisted they'd spotted Violet at a truck stop in Montgomery on Sunday, except the woman turned out to be a completely different person who happened to have auburn hair. Each tip required investigation. Each investigation led nowhere. The white panel van became a particular obsession. Multiple witnesses reported seeing it in the general area that Saturday, but descriptions varied wildly. Was it white or cream-colored? Did it have windows or was it windowless? Was the driver young or old? Clean-shaven or bearded? The van seemed to materialize differently in each witness's memory, shaped by fear and the desperate need to have seen something helpful. Caldwell spent 2 weeks tracking down every white panel van in Covington County and the surrounding areas. He interviewed 17 different owners. Every single one had explanations for their whereabouts on November 10th. Every single one checked out. The white panel van, if it had ever existed as anything more than misidentification or false memory, vanished as completely as Violet herself. The textile mill became another focus of the investigation. Violet's car had been abandoned in the employee parking lot, which suggested the perpetrator either worked at the mill or was familiar enough with the facility to know the lot would be empty on Sunday. Caldwell and his deputies interviewed 63 mill employees over the course of 2 weeks. They asked about Saturday schedules, about anyone who'd seemed suspicious, about any employee who'd shown unusual interest in young women. One of those routine interviews took place on November 19th, 1979. Raymond Lee Pritchard, age 34, worked as a maintenance technician at the mill. He'd been employed there for 8 years, handling routine repairs to the machinery and building systems. Deputy Curtis Perkins conducted the interview, asking standard questions from a checklist. Where were you Saturday, November 10th? Home alone, doing yard work. Did anyone see you? Probably neighbors, though I didn't talk to anyone. Did you know Violet Thompson? Only by sight. She was a waitress downtown, right? Did you ever see anything suspicious at the mill? No, sir. Do you have any information that might help this investigation? I wish I did. Terrible thing. What happened to that girl? Perkins noted that Pritchard seemed cooperative and showed appropriate concern about the case. Nothing in the interaction raised red flags. Nothing suggested this quiet, unremarkable maintenance worker deserved additional scrutiny. Pritchard's name went into the file along with 62 others, all of them interviewed and cleared. The fundamental problem facing Caldwell's investigation was the lack of physical evidence. Violet's car told them nothing. No fingerprints beyond those belonging to Violet and her family members. No suspicious fibers or hair. No signs of forced entry or struggle. No witnesses who'd actually seen Violet after 3:15 p.m. Saturday. The case was all questions and no answers, all theories and no proof. By the end of November, the daily search parties had dwindled. The tip line had gone quiet. Caldwell continued working the case, but he was honest enough to admit, at least to himself, that he was running out of leads to pursue. The file on his desk grew thicker with dead ends and false trails, but no closer to the truth. December 1979 passed. January 1980 arrived. Violet Thompson's enrollment at Auburn University came and went, her application sitting on her bedroom desk, never completed. The community began using past tense when discussing her, a linguistic shift that acknowledged what everyone feared. Violet wasn't coming home. In March 1980, brief hope flickered when a farmer discovered skeletal remains in a wooded area 15 miles outside Andalusia. For 48 terrible hours, the Thompson family braced themselves for the worst. But forensic analysis determined the remains belonged to a male, approximately 60 years old, dead for at least 5 years. An unsolved case, certainly, but not Violet. By 1981, the Violet Thompson case had officially transitioned from active to dormant. Caldwell kept the file on his desk rather than boxing it away, a small act of defiance against the inevitable. But no new leads emerged. No witnesses came forward with overlooked information. No deathbed confessions arrived. The case joined the ranks of unsolved disappearances that haunt small-town law enforcement, cases where everyone knows something terrible happened, but the proof necessary for justice remains forever out of reach. Or so it seemed. Walter Thompson refused to accept the silence. While Sheriff Caldwell's investigation stalled, Walter transformed his garage into something between a command center and a shrine. He would spend the next 27 years of his life searching for his daughter, never knowing that the answer he sought was sealed beneath concrete just 3 miles from his house. The man who put her there attended Walter's funeral in 2008, standing quietly in the back of the church, one mourner among many, invisible as always. Walter Thompson's garage became a place his family learned not to enter uninvited. In the weeks after Violet's disappearance, he'd cleared out his tools and workbench, transforming the space into something that existed between a war room and a memorial. Road maps of Covington County and surrounding areas covered every wall, marked with colored pins denoting search locations, witness sightings, and areas yet to be explored. A filing cabinet held copies of every police report, every interview transcript, every scrap of documentation related to his daughter's case. A corkboard displayed photographs of Violet at different ages, her high school graduation portrait holding the central position. Every Saturday and Sunday for years, Walter drove the back roads of southeastern Alabama. He walked through forests and examined abandoned buildings. He knocked on doors in neighboring counties, showing Violet's photograph, asking the same questions that had produced no answers for months, then years. His methodical mind, the same quality that made him an excellent lumber mill supervisor, convinced him that if he searched long enough, covered enough ground, asked enough people, eventually he would find something. He would bring his daughter home. The obsession took a visible toll. Walter's hair, dark brown in November 1979, had turned completely white by 1983. He lost 30 pounds, his frame growing gaunt as he skipped meals to drive out to one more location, check one more abandoned property. Co-workers at the lumber mill noticed how he'd become distant, distracted, his mind always somewhere else. On April 12, 1984, Walter suffered a massive heart attack while searching a wooded area near the Conecuh County line. A passing motorist found him collapsed beside his truck and called for help. At the hospital, doctors told him bluntly, another heart attack would likely kill him. He needed to reduce stress, take his medication, stop the relentless physical activity of his weekend searches. Walter went home from the hospital on April 20th. By April 21st, he was back in his garage studying his maps. Dorothy Thompson coped differently. While her husband searched the physical world, she turned to faith and ritual. Every morning at 6 a.m., the time Violet used to leave for her shift at the Red Door Cafe, Dorothy lit a white candle and placed it in the front window of their Hillcrest Avenue home. She would stand there for 5 minutes in silent prayer, asking God to watch over her daughter wherever she was, to bring her home safely, to give the family strength to endure another day of not knowing. The candle ritual never stopped, not on holidays, not during Dorothy's own illnesses, not when hurricanes knocked out power and she had to light the candle by flashlight. For 45 years, that flame appeared in the window at 6 a.m., a beacon of hope that neighbors could set their watches by. Dorothy kept Violet's bedroom exactly as it had been on November 10th, 1979. The bed remained made with its yellow floral comforter. Violet's high school yearbooks sat on the shelf alongside her collection of Laura Ingalls Wilder novels. The closet still held her clothes, preserved as if she might walk through the door at any moment and need something to wear. Once a week, Dorothy dusted the room and changed the bedding, maintaining the space like a sacred trust. Violet is in God's hands, Dorothy would tell anyone who asked how she maintained such unwavering faith. I may not understand his timing, but I trust his plan. She'll come home when he's ready for her to come home. The local church began holding an annual prayer service each November 10th, marking the anniversary of Violet's disappearance. Dorothy attended every single one, sitting in the front pew with Walter beside her, singing hymns about God's mercy and eternal grace. She never cried during these services, at least not visibly. Her faith appeared unshakable, even as the years stretched from 5 to 10 to 20. The burden of caregiving eventually fell to Carolyn, Violet's younger sister. Caroline had been 17 when Violet disappeared, a junior in high school with dreams of attending college somewhere far from Alabama. Those dreams evaporated as she watched her parents deteriorate under the weight of loss. Her father's heart condition worsened. Her mother's hands began shaking from anxiety she refused to acknowledge. Caroline stayed in Andalusia after high school graduation. She took a job at the bank, the same First National where Violet had made her last deposit. She married Kenny Hayes, a local boy who understood that Caroline came with obligations to her broken family. They bought a house 4 blocks from Hillcrest Avenue so Caroline could check on her parents daily. When Walter's second heart attack forced him into early retirement in 1995, Caroline took over managing their finances. When Dorothy's arthritis made lighting the morning candle difficult, Caroline arrived at 5:55 a.m. to help her mother maintain the ritual. Caroline's own life became secondary to preserving what remained of her family. She and Kenny never had children. Caroline insisted she couldn't handle the responsibility when her parents needed so much care. She never took vacations longer than 3 days because leaving her parents felt like abandonment. She watched friends move away for careers and adventures while she remained in Andalusia, tethered to a tragedy that predated her adult life, but defined it nonetheless. Frank Thompson, the youngest sibling, chose escape. He'd been 14 when Violet vanished, old enough to understand what was happening, but too young to do anything about it. He watched his father disappear into the garage and his mother retreat into ritual. He watched his home transform from a place of laughter into a museum of grief. Frank left for the University of Georgia in 1983 and never truly came back. He built a life in Atlanta, a successful career, commercial real estate, a wife who'd never known the Thompson family before the tragedy, 2 daughters who called their grandfather Papa Walter, but saw him maybe twice a year. Frank's visits to Andalusia grew increasingly rare, the weight of his family's unresolved trauma too heavy to carry while trying to build his own happiness. He felt guilty about this distance, but not guilty enough to close it. The community of Andalusia transformed in ways both subtle and profound. Doors that had remained unlocked for generations now featured deadbolts. Parents who'd once let children roam freely until dinner time began enforcing strict curfews and demanding to know exactly where their kids were at all times. The easy trust that had characterized small-town life curdled into suspicion. Who among them might be dangerous? Who might be hiding something? The Red Door Cafe never quite recovered its atmosphere of warmth and community gathering. Marlene Patterson kept the business running until 1995, but the cafe's soul had departed with Violet. Regular customers couldn't stop seeing her ghost, pouring coffee, laughing at bad jokes, moving between tables with practiced grace. When Marlene finally sold the business, new owners tried rebranding it as Main Street Diner, but locals still called it the Red Door, still remembered what had been lost. As years became decades, the Violet Thompson case transitioned from active tragedy to local legend to something approaching folklore. Younger residents knew the story in outline form. A girl who disappeared in 1979, never found, never solved, but lacked the emotional connection that haunted older generations. The case became one of those dark stories that defines a place, like the haunted bridge in the next county over, or the cemetery that supposedly held Revolutionary War soldiers. Walter Thompson died on March 2, 2008, at age 73, his heart finally giving out after decades of strain. He'd spent 28 years searching for Violet, filling 19 filing cabinets with documentation, driving an estimated 47,000 miles on his weekend searches. His funeral drew hundreds of mourners who recognized his devotion, even if they couldn't fully comprehend the depth of his loss. He was buried in Hillcrest Cemetery, in a plot that had 3 spaces, one for him, one for Dorothy, and one empty space between them, waiting. Dorothy Thompson lived 8 more years. She attended Walter's funeral with the same composed faith she'd shown for decades, certain they would be reunited in heaven, confident that God's plan included answers they'd been denied on earth. She continued lighting the candle each morning, continued maintaining Violet's bedroom, continued believing. She died on January 17, 2016, at age 81. Caroline found her that morning at 6:15 a.m., sitting in the chair by the front window, the candle lit beside her, at peace. The autopsy listed the cause as heart failure, but everyone who knew Dorothy understood she died of a broken heart that had somehow kept beating for 36 years after it shattered. For 45 years, Dorothy Thompson lit a candle every morning, believing her daughter would come home. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell so you don't miss stories like this. These families deserve to have their stories told. Walter and Dorothy were buried side by side at Hillcrest Cemetery. The space between them remained empty, waiting for the daughter who'd never come home. At least, everyone thought she'd never come home. They didn't know she'd been less than 3 miles away the entire time. October 8, 2024, 45 years after Violet Thompson vanished, began as a routine demolition job. Redstone Development Group had purchased the abandoned Andalusia textile mill property with plans to construct a regional distribution center. The building had stood empty for 42 years, its windows shattered by vandals, its roof slowly caving in, kudzu vines consuming the exterior walls. It was an eyesore the community was happy to see finally coming down. Marcus Riley had been operating heavy machinery for 23 years. He'd demolished factories, warehouses, shopping centers, structures that had outlived their purpose and needed to be erased to make room for whatever came next. The textile mill job was straightforward. Bring down the building, clear the foundation, prep the site for new construction. His excavator's bucket bit into the basement floor at approximately 10:15 a.m. The concrete should have been maybe 6 inches thick, standard for an industrial building of that era. But when the concrete fractured, Riley immediately noticed something wrong. The floor was far thicker than it should have been, at least 3 feet deep, and the concrete looked different, newer, poured separately from the original foundation. The excavator bucket broke through completely on its 3rd strike. Riley leaned forward in his cab, looking down into the cavity that had opened below. What he saw made him grab his radio with shaking hands. "Shut down operations. We need police here right now." The canvas tarp had deteriorated after more than 4 decades sealed in darkness, but enough remained to identify what it contained. Human remains, curled in a fetal position, wrapped carefully like someone packing away something they didn't want damaged. The concrete tomb had preserved the scene in ways that defied normal decomposition. The seal had been almost perfect. But what made Riley's stomach turn wasn't just the remains themselves. Fragments of fabric were still visible, red and white stripes, the distinctive pattern of a 1970s diner uniform. And tucked against the basement wall, as if placed there deliberately for safekeeping, was a brown leather purse. Andalusia police arrived within 8 minutes. Covington County Sheriff's deputies were on scene 5 minutes after that. By 11:00 a.m., the site had been cordoned off with crime scene tape, and word was spreading through the community with the speed that only small-town news can travel. Something had been found at the old textile mill, something that had been hidden for a very long time. Sheriff Amanda Morrison was 39 years old, born in Andalusia, raised on stories of Violet Thompson's disappearance. Her mother had been in the same high school class as Caroline Thompson. Morrison had attended Dorothy Thompson's funeral in 2016, had seen the empty cemetery plot that waited between Walter and Dorothy's graves. She joined law enforcement in part because of cases like Violet's, cases that haunted communities for generations, that cried out for justice, even across decades. When the call came through about human remains at the textile mill, Morrison knew immediately. She just knew. She arrived at the scene at 11:23 a.m. and descended carefully into the basement where the excavator had broken through the concrete tomb. The fragments of red and white uniform confirmed what her instincts had already told her. She stood there for a long moment, looking at what had been hidden since 1979, and said quietly to herself, "We found you, Violet. We finally found you." By afternoon, Morrison had assembled a task force. This wasn't a case the Covington County Sheriff's Office could handle alone, not after 45 years, not with the technical expertise required for such an old crime scene. The Alabama Bureau of Investigation sent a forensic team. The FBI field office in Mobile dispatched 2 agents with specialized training in cold cases. The medical examiner from Montgomery drove down personally. The excavation proceeded with painstaking care over the next 6 hours. Every fragment was documented, photographed, catalogued. The remains were removed with the kind of reverence usually reserved for archaeological sites. The leather purse was opened with extreme caution, its contents inventoried piece by piece. Inside the purse, a driver's license with Violet's photograph and information, $17 in cash, a pack of double mint gum, a tube of lipstick, the small notebook where Violet tracked her college savings deposits, the last entry dated November 9th, 1979, showing a balance of $2,047.3, and tucked in an inner pocket, a folded piece of paper with Daniel Holloway's phone number written in Violet's handwriting, the ink still visible after 45 years sealed away from light and air. The forensic examination began immediately. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the state's chief medical examiner, conducted her preliminary analysis on site before transport. The skeleton was intact, allowing for detailed examination. What she found provided the first concrete answers in a case built entirely on questions. Blunt force trauma to the posterior skull. 2 distinct impact points, both from behind, either of which would have been fatal. The attack had been sudden and brutal. Violet Thompson never saw her killer coming. Based on the injury patterns, death would have been nearly instantaneous, a small mercy in a case with precious few mercies to offer. The remains were transported to Montgomery for comprehensive forensic analysis. By 2024, DNA testing had advanced far beyond what anyone in 1979 could have imagined. Even bone samples from remains 4 decades old could yield genetic profiles with remarkable accuracy. On October 11th, 2024, 3 days after Marcus Riley's excavator broke through concrete, the DNA results came back with 99.97% certainty. The remains found in the textile mill basement were Violet Grace Thompson. Dental records provided additional confirmation. A filling in her lower left molar matched dental work documented in her 1978 records. For 45 years, people had wondered where Violet Thompson was. For 45 years, her family had searched, hoped, grieved, and died without answers. Now finally, those answers were beginning to emerge. Violet had never left Andalusia. She'd been 3 miles from her parents' house on Hillcrest Avenue the entire time. 3 miles from the cemetery where her parents were buried with an empty space between them. 3 miles from the Red Door Cafe where she'd worked her last shift. She'd been sealed beneath concrete in a building that hundreds of people had passed without knowing they were walking past her tomb. Caroline Hayes, now 62 years old, received the notification from Sheriff Morrison on October 11th. She'd been waiting 45 years for this phone call, dreading it and praying for it in equal measure. When Morrison confirmed the DNA results, Caroline sat down in her kitchen and wept for 30 minutes straight. Then she composed herself, called her brother Frank in Atlanta, and began planning what came next. They could finally bring Violet home. But first, they needed to find out who had taken her from them. After 45 years, the mystery had transformed. It was no longer about where Violet Thompson was. It was about who had killed her. And 45-year-old crime scenes, it turns out, can still give up their secrets. The forensic technology, available in 2024, would have seemed like science fiction to Sheriff Vernon Caldwell in 1979. Where Caldwell had fingerprint powder and basic photography, the modern investigation team deployed tools that could extract information from evidence at the molecular level. The textile mill crime scene represented a rare convergence. Old evidence meeting new science, creating possibilities that hadn't existed when Violet Thompson disappeared. Dr. Patricia Reeves coordinated the forensic analysis from Montgomery, working with specialists from multiple disciplines. Every fragment recovered from the concrete tomb underwent exhaustive examination. The investigation proceeded with methodical precision, each test building on previous results, each finding narrowing the field of possibilities. The soil analysis provided the first breakthrough. Soil samples collected from around the remains contained distinct mineral compositions and pollen signatures. Modern forensic palynology, the study of pollen and spores, allowed scientists to identify not just where soil originated, but when it was disturbed based on the pollen types present. The samples contained pollen from ragweed and goldenrod consistent with late autumn in southeastern Alabama. More specifically, the pollen signature matched November, exactly when Violet vanished. But soil wasn't the only material mixed into the concrete that had sealed the tomb. Microscopic analysis revealed metal shavings, tiny fragments that suggested whoever poured the concrete had been working near industrial machinery. The shavings contained trace elements consistent with textile manufacturing equipment from the 1970s and early 1980s. Whoever buried Violet had access to the textile mill, familiarity with its layout, and knowledge of concrete mixing. The crucial breakthrough came from Violet's leather purse. The concrete seal had preserved it in remarkable condition, and when forensic specialists examined it under high-powered microscopy, they discovered microscopic fibers embedded in the leather. Fibers that hadn't been there when Violet purchased the purse from Johnson's department store in 1978. The fibers came from industrial work gloves, the heavy-duty type used by maintenance workers and machine operators. But these weren't generic fibers. Chemical analysis revealed the presence of a specific type of machine oil, Texaco Regal oil, R&O 460, used for lubricating textile machinery in the 1970s. The oil had a distinctive chemical signature that modern mass spectrometry could identify with absolute certainty. Someone wearing work gloves contaminated with Texaco Regal oil, R&O 460, had handled Violet's purse. Someone with access to textile mill machinery. Someone who worked with their hands. Sheriff Morrison pulled the 1979 employment records from the Andalusia textile mill. The building might be demolished, but the company's personnel files had been preserved in storage when the mill closed in, 1982. She now had a specific target, maintenance workers and machine operators who would have routinely used that particular oil on their hands and gloves. The initial list contained 47 names. Cross-referencing with individuals who'd been working on November 10, 1979, narrowed it to 22. Eliminating those who died in the intervening years brought the list to 14 living former employees. 14 names. One of them was a killer who'd evaded justice for 45 years. The Alabama Bureau of Investigation began running comprehensive background checks on all 14 individuals, looking for any red flags, criminal history, complaints, anything that might have been missed in 1979. Modern databases connected information across jurisdictions in ways that hadn't been possible in the 1970s, when each county maintained its own separate records. 13 names came back clean or with minor issues unrelated to violence, DUIs, property disputes, tax problems. The 14th name flagged multiple hits. Raymond Lee Pritchard, age 79, current residence, Opp, Alabama, employment record, maintenance technician at Andalusia Textile Mill, 1971-1985. And then the deeper history emerged, piece by piece, from databases that finally talked to each other across jurisdictions and decades. 1971, questioned regarding sexual assault allegation in Coffee County. No charges filed. Victim declined to proceed with complaint after suspect's employer vouched for his character. 1974, arrested for disorderly conduct in Geneva County after altercation outside a bar. Charges reduced to public intoxication, paid fine. 1979, interviewed as routine witness following Violet Thompson's disappearance. Deputy Curtis Perkins noted, "Cooperative, no concerns." Morrison pulled the original 1979 interview transcript. Pritchard had told Deputy Perkins he'd been home alone doing yard work on November 10, 1979. No alibi, no witnesses, but also no reason to suspect him among 63 mill employees who'd been interviewed. He'd seemed appropriately concerned about Violet's disappearance. He'd answered questions without hesitation. Nothing had raised red flags. 45 years later, with modern investigative tools, those red flags were finally visible. The 1971 sexual assault questioning, the pattern of living alone, avoiding relationships, maintaining distance from co-workers, the access to the textile mill building, the work gloves contaminated with the exact oil found on Violet's purse. On November 2, 2024, Sheriff Morrison obtained a search warrant for Raymond Pritchard's residence in Opp. At 6 a.m. on November 5th, a tactical team executed the warrant. Pritchard answered the door in pajamas, confused and cooperative, the same demeanor he'd shown Deputy Perkins in 1979. What investigators found inside the modest ranch house would provide the final pieces of evidence necessary for prosecution. In a bedroom closet, inside a locked metal box hidden beneath old tax returns, they discovered a gold cross necklace on a delicate chain. The back of the cross bore an engraving, VGT, Love, Mom and Dad, 1977. Violet Grace Thompson's 16th birthday present. The necklace Dorothy Thompson had mentioned to Sheriff Caldwell in 1979, the one Violet wore every day and was wearing the day she disappeared. The necklace that had never been found with her remains or in her abandoned car. Raymond Pritchard had kept it for 45 years. A trophy. A memento of what he'd done. In the garage, investigators found a 1977 Ford F-150 pickup truck that Pritchard still owned, though he no longer drove it. Soil samples taken from the truck bed, analyzed using modern forensic techniques, matched the soil composition found in the concrete tomb. The microscopic mineral signature was identical. This truck had transported the materials used to bury Violet Thompson. In a dresser drawer wrapped in plastic, investigators found a pair of work gloves. The gloves were decades old, leather cracked with age, but preserved with evident care. DNA testing revealed traces of blood on the right glove's palm, blood that matched Violet Thompson's genetic profile, extracted from her recovered remains. Perhaps most damning was the journal discovered in Pritchard's nightstand. He'd kept a diary intermittently from the 1970s through the early 2000s, entries written in a personal shorthand that investigators would spend days decoding. The entry for November 11th, 1979, written the day after Violet disappeared, had been translated by forensic linguists. It's done. She won't say no again. Nobody knows. The concrete sets tomorrow. Then it's finished forever. Additional entries from the weeks following detailed his watching the Thompson family's anguish, monitoring the investigation's progress, convincing himself he'd committed the perfect crime. The journal confirmed what the physical evidence already proved. Raymond Lee Pritchard had stalked Violet Thompson, murdered her when she rejected his advances, and hidden her body in a location he accessed through his work at the mill. For 45 years, he'd believed he'd gotten away with it. For 45 years, he'd kept his trophies and his secrets, confident that 1979's limited technology couldn't touch him. He was right about 1979, but science had caught up, and science doesn't forget. On December 3, 2024, at 6:47 a.m., Raymond Lee Pritchard was formally arrested and charged with the murder of Violet Grace Thompson. He was 79 years old. He'd lived 54 more years than his victim ever got the chance to. The man who'd hidden in plain sight for nearly half a century was finally, irrevocably, caught. Raymond Lee Pritchard had lived in Opp, Alabama since 1985, a quiet town 20 miles from Andalusia, close enough to maintain familiarity with the area, but far enough to establish psychological distance from the crime he'd committed. His modest ranch house on Pine Street looked like 1,000 other houses in small-town Alabama. Beige siding, neatly trimmed lawn, American flag on the porch. Nothing about the property suggested anything other than an ordinary retiree living out his final years in unremarkable peace. His neighbors knew him as Ray, the quiet older man who kept to himself but maintained his property impeccably. He mowed his lawn every Saturday morning during growing season. He raked leaves meticulously each fall. He kept his truck washed and his driveway clear. In a region where lawn care serves as a barometer of character, Pritchard passed every test. He attended Opp Community Church semi-regularly, sitting alone in the back pew, arriving after services began and leaving before they ended. He never joined Bible study groups or volunteered for church activities. He donated modestly to the collection plate. He was the kind of congregant who existed on the periphery, present but not participating, visible but not memorable. Thomas Brennan lived next door to Pritchard for 12 years. He would later tell reporters, Ray was the perfect neighbor, quiet, kept his yard nice, never caused problems. He helped me fix my lawnmower just last summer, spent 2 hours in my garage getting it running again. We talked about engine mechanics and the weather. Normal conversation, normal guy. How was I supposed to know? That was the genius of Raymond Pritchard's disguise. He understood that being perfectly ordinary was the best camouflage. He never drew attention, never caused conflict, never gave anyone a reason to look twice at him. For 45 years, while Walter Thompson searched desperately for his daughter, while Dorothy lit candles every morning, while Caroline sacrificed her life to care for her broken parents, Raymond Pritchard lived freely just 20 miles away, hidden behind a facade of aggressive normalcy. He'd never married, never had a long-term relationship. When asked about his solitary life, he'd offer vague explanations about being set in his ways, about valuing independence. People accepted these explanations because they didn't particularly care about the personal life of a quiet neighbor who minded his own business. The truth, investigators would later piece together, was that Raymond Pritchard deliberately avoided relationships because relationships required vulnerability, openness, trust, all things that might lead to discovery. Isolation was protection. Distance was survival. But the isolation hadn't been complete during his years at the textile mill. Former co-workers, contacted by investigators after his arrest, began sharing memories that had seemed insignificant at the time, but took on darker meaning in retrospect. Janet Crawford had worked in the mill's administrative office from 1976 to 1981. She remembered Pritchard clearly. He made the women uncomfortable. He'd stare. Not obviously, he was too smart for that. But you'd feel his eyes on you. You'd turn around, and he'd be watching from across the room. If you confronted him, he'd act confused, like he didn't know what you were talking about. It was unsettling, but not enough to report. What would you even say? He looks at me. Michael Torres, who'd worked alongside Pritchard in maintenance, recalled. Ray never socialized with the guys, never went out for beers on Friday, never talked about his personal life. He'd do his job, keep his head down, then disappear. I always figured he was just antisocial. Now I wonder what he was going home to. The revelation that would devastate Marlene Patterson came from her own memory, unlocked by Sheriff Morrison's questions. Yes, Marlene remembered Raymond Pritchard. He'd been a regular customer at the Red Door Cafe during the late 1970s. He came in several times a week, always during afternoon shifts, always sitting in the same booth near the back, always when Violet was working. He made Violet uncomfortable, Marlene told Morrison, the memory returning after 45 years. She mentioned it to me maybe 2 months before she disappeared. Said there was a customer who watched her too much, who'd sit there nursing 1 cup of coffee for an hour, just watching her work. She asked if she could trade sections with the other waitress when he came in. I told her yes, of course. Marlene's voice broke during the interview. I should have asked more questions. I should have paid more attention. But creepy customers were just part of the job back then. You dealt with it and moved on. I had no idea. Pritchard's journal, recovered from his home, documented the stalking in meticulous detail. He'd recorded Violet's work schedule, noting which days she opened and which days she worked shorter shifts. He documented her car, noting where she parked and what route she drove home. He'd written about watching her at church, at the grocery store, at the bank. He'd built a complete profile of her routines and movements. The entries revealed his escalating obsession. Initially, he'd simply noted observations. By October 1979, the entries had shifted to fantasies about approaching her, about her recognizing his attention, about them being together. By early November, the tone had darkened to anger about her ignoring him, about her not understanding that they were meant to be together. The entry from November 10, 1979, suggested the trigger. Investigators theorized that Pritchard had approached Violet that Saturday afternoon, likely after she left the Texaco station. He'd possibly pulled his truck alongside her car at a stoplight or in a parking lot. He'd finally made his intentions known, a romantic advance he'd been building toward for months. Violet had rejected him, perhaps kindly, perhaps firmly, but she'd said no. And for Raymond Pritchard, whose fantasy had consumed him for months, that rejection was intolerable. The journal entry suggested rage. She won't say no again. The textile mill had been his workplace, his territory. He knew every corner of that building. He likely lured or forced Violet there under some pretense. The attack happened quickly. Blunt force trauma from behind suggested she never saw it coming. Then came the calculated cover-up, wrapping the body, digging out part of the basement floor, mixing concrete, sealing the tomb. The dawn arrest on December 3, 2024, shattered the quiet of Pine Street in Opp. Neighbors emerged from their homes to see tactical team vehicles surrounding Ray Pritchard's house, to watch the elderly man being led out in handcuffs, to witness the complete demolition of everything they'd thought they knew about their neighbor. Susan Martinez lived 3 houses down. She told reporters, "He waved to me every morning when I left for work. Every single morning for 8 years, he'd wave and smile. He was at the neighborhood block party last summer. He brought potato salad. How do you process that? How do you reconcile the man who brings potato salad with a man who murdered a girl and hid her body for 45 years? That was the terrible lesson Raymond Pritchard taught. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like everyone else. Sometimes they mow their lawns and fix lawnmowers and wave at neighbors and attend church. Sometimes evil wears the most ordinary face imaginable, and it walks among us unseen. The news of Raymond Pritchard's arrest detonated through Covington County like a shockwave. Within hours of his December 3rd arrest, every news outlet in Alabama had picked up the story. By evening, national media had arrived. A 45-year-old cold case solved. A killer who'd lived freely for nearly half a century. A family that had waited their entire adult lives for answers. But beneath the headlines and news reports, 2 communities grappled with a more painful question. How had they missed this? Caroline Hayes stood on the front porch of her parents' home on Hillcrest Avenue on December 4th, facing a cluster of reporters and neighbors. She was 62 years old, her face lined with decades of grief and caregiving. In her hands, she held a framed photograph of Violet from 1979. Auburn hair, warm smile, a young woman who'd had her entire life ahead of her. "Violet was real," Caroline said, her voice steady despite obvious emotion. "She wasn't just a cold case or a mystery or a story people tell. She was my sister who taught me to ride a bike. She was the person who braided my hair before school and snuck me extra dessert when Mom wasn't looking. She had dreams. She had plans. She had people who loved her." Caroline paused, looking at the photograph in her hands. For 45 years, my family lived in agony. My father died searching for her. My mother died believing God would reveal the truth in his own time. And now we know Violet was 3 miles away the entire time. 3 miles. We drove past that building hundreds of times. She looked up at the cameras. I'm grateful for the investigators who finally found her. I'm grateful for the science that identified her killer. But I'm also angry. Angry that this man got to live a full life while Violet's ended at 20. Angry that he walked past us, lived near us, breathed the same air, and we never knew. Frank Thompson returned to Andalusia for the first time in 2 years, flying in from Atlanta the day after the arrest. Now 59, he'd spent most of his adult life trying to escape the shadow of his sister's disappearance. The news that her killer had been caught brought him back to the place he'd tried so hard to leave behind. I could have passed him on the street, Frank told reporters. When I'd come home to visit Mom and Dad, I drove through Ops sometimes. I might have seen him at a gas station or a grocery store and never known I was looking at the man who killed my sister. That thought is going to haunt me for the rest of my life. The collective guilt settled over both communities like a suffocating blanket. Neighbors in Op questioned every interaction they'd had with Raymond Pritchard. Residents of Andalusia revisited memories from 1979, wondering what they'd missed, what they'd failed to report, what small detail might have changed everything. The painful truth was that the system had failed at multiple levels. In the 1970s, information sharing between jurisdictions was minimal. Raymond Pritchard's 1971 questioning for sexual assault in Coffee County never made it into any database accessible to Covington County investigators. The complaint filed against him existed only in paper files that no one thought to cross-reference. More painfully, the concerns raised by women who worked with Pritchard at the textile mill, who served him at the Red Door Cafe, who felt uncomfortable under his stare. Those concerns had been dismissed as just part of life. Women in 1979 were expected to tolerate discomfort from men. Being watched wasn't a crime. Making someone uneasy wasn't reportable. The culture had failed to take women's instincts seriously, and Violet Thompson had paid the price. Curtis Perkins, now 72 and long retired from law enforcement, gave a painful interview to the Andalusia Star News. He'd been the deputy who interviewed Raymond Pritchard in November 1979, who'd noted cooperative, no concerns in the report. I should have done more, Perkins said, his voice heavy with regret. I should have listened better, pushed harder, asked more questions. I interviewed him for maybe 20 minutes and moved on to the next person on the list. He had no alibi, but lots of people didn't have alibis for that Saturday. I didn't see any red flags because I didn't know what to look for. Vernon Caldwell did the best he could with what we had, and I did my job the way I was trained. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. Churches throughout Covington County held healing services in the weeks following the arrest. First Baptist Church of Andalusia, where the Thompson family had worshipped for generations, dedicated a Sunday service to Violet's memory. Pastor Michael Green spoke about justice delayed but not denied, about faith sustained through impossible trials, about a community learning from its failures. Sheriff Amanda Morrison used the media attention to advocate for increased funding for cold case investigations and better evidence preservation protocols. Technology will continue to advance, she told a press conference. Cases that seem unsolvable today might be solvable in 10 or 20 years, but only if we preserve evidence, maintain records, and refuse to give up on victims and their families. On December 15, 2024, a memorial was erected in Andalusia City Park, a bronze plaque mounted on a stone marker beneath a dogwood tree. The plaque bore Violet's photograph, her dates, and a simple inscription: Violet Grace Thompson, beloved daughter, sister, friend, taken too soon, never forgotten, justice found. Raymond Pritchard's trial was scheduled for spring 2025. Legal experts predicted a straightforward prosecution. The physical evidence was overwhelming, the forensic analysis conclusive, the journal entries damning. But Pritchard himself remained silent. He'd invoked his right to an attorney and refused all interviews. No confession, no remorse, no explanation for why he'd taken a young woman's life and destroyed a family. His silence was, in some ways, the final cruelty. Even caught, even facing life imprisonment for a murder committed 45 years ago, Raymond Pritchard would take his full story to the grave. He'd controlled Violet's death. He'd controlled the secret for 45 years. He would control the narrative until the very end. But he couldn't control the justice that was finally, inevitably coming for him. And he couldn't erase the fact that Violet Grace Thompson, after 45 years of darkness, had finally been brought into the light. The Violet Thompson case teaches lessons that reach far beyond Andalusia, Alabama. It demonstrates that forensic science can reach back through decades, that concrete tombs can be broken open, that secrets sealed in 1979 can be exposed in 2024. Technology advances, DNA analysis improves. Cold cases that seemed forever unsolvable become prosecutable with evidence that was always there, simply waiting for science to catch up. But the case also teaches a darker lesson. Predators understand that the best hiding place is in plain sight. Raymond Pritchard survived 45 years of freedom, not by being clever or sophisticated, but by being unremarkable. He mowed his lawn. He kept to himself. He presented no obvious red flags to neighbors who had no reason to suspect the quiet man next door harbored such horrific secrets. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it lives on your street, waves from the driveway, and fades into the background of ordinary life. The extraordinary toll on families like the Thompsons can never be fully measured. Walter died in 2008 without knowing what happened to his daughter, his final years consumed by a search that would outlive him. Dorothy died in 2016, lighting her candle every morning for 36 years after her husband's death, sustained by faith that the truth would eventually emerge. They both died without closure, without answers, without justice. That reality cannot be changed or softened, even by the eventual resolution of the case. But justice matters regardless of how much time has passed. Violet Thompson was murdered on November 10, 1979. That crime didn't become less serious because decades passed. The young woman with auburn hair who dreamed of teaching children, who saved for college dollar by dollar, who fell in love and braided her sister's hair, and made customers at the Red Door Cafe feel welcome. Her life mattered then, and it matters now. Justice delayed for 45 years is still justice worth pursuing. One question lingers in the minds of investigators. Were there other victims? The trophy box found in Raymond Pritchard's home contained Violet's gold cross necklace, carefully preserved for 45 years. Why keep it unless taking it meant something? Trophy taking suggests the possibility of repeat offenses, of other crimes that might never have been connected to this quiet maintenance worker who moved through life, leaving barely a trace. Investigators continue examining unsolved cases from areas where Pritchard lived and worked, searching for patterns that might reveal additional victims. That question may never be fully answered, but the fundamental truth of this case remains clear and unchangeable. On November 10, 1979, a young woman with dreams and plans and people who loved her was murdered. Her family suffered for 45 years, searching, hoping, grieving, dying without answers. An October excavation brought her into the light. Modern science identified her killer, and Raymond Pritchard, who believed he'd committed the perfect crime, will face judgment. On December 20th, 2024, Caroline Hayes stood at the memorial in Andalusia City Park, placing a bouquet of white roses at the base of the stone marker bearing her sister's name. She'd driven to the park at dawn, wanting this moment to be private before the day began. "Mom always said God would reveal the truth when the time was right," Caroline said quietly to the empty park. "I used to wonder why God's timing required my parents to die without knowing. I still don't fully understand. But you're found now, Violet. You're finally found. And He's going to pay for what He did to you. Dad would have wanted that. Mom prayed for that. It took 45 years, but you're coming home." Later that morning, Caroline returned to the house on Hillcrest Avenue, the house where she'd grown up, where her parents had lived and died waiting for their daughter to come home. She walked to the front window, the same window where Dorothy had stood every morning for 45 years. Carolyn struck a match and lit a white candle. She placed it in the window, exactly where her mother had placed it thousands of times before. The flame caught, held steady, and burned bright against the morning light. The candle still burns, for Violet, for all the victims whose stories remain untold, for justice that sometimes takes decades to arrive, but matters just as much when it finally does. What cold case do you think deserves more attention? Drop your answer in the comments. Every unsolved case represents a family still waiting for closure, like the Thompsons finally received after 45 years. If this story moved you, share it with someone who appreciates true crime that honors the victims. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Justice may be delayed, but it should never be denied.